Hey folks, John Peterson here, and today I want to spend a couple minutes talking about sharpening. Now, there's a ton of information out on the web, and there's a lot of great information out there. So if you're interested in sharpening, definitely go out and do a lot of research. There is a lot of competing opinions that you have to be careful of. And my one big advice when it comes to sharpening is try it for yourself. Experiment with the tools, see what you like and what works best with your camera files, and go with that. Really develop your own recipe. But today I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about sharpening. If you don't do it, wanted to give you some quick tips on how to easily do it in Lightroom and why you should do it. So let's just talk real briefly about what is sharpening. Sharpening, in essence, increases the contrast between pixels. Sharpening, in essence, increases the clarity and focus of a photo by making soft edges more distinct. It can help reduce the blurriness and emphasize small details in a photograph. So sharpening works pretty simply. There's algorithms in the program to detect edges, and it applies sharpening to the edges that it finds. What it often does is, in terms of contrast, sharpening increases the contrast between light and dark areas and between edge pixels. Sharpening also enhances the definition of edges in an image, so it's really looking for those edge details. And what sharpening can do is it can add local contrast and bring out fine details in certain parts of an image. There's a general amount of sharpening that one can apply during the development process, but sharpening for a specific output, whether you're going to the web or whether you're going to print, that's a whole nother story, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. But let's jump into Lightroom and take a look at some of the sharpening techniques that I use when looking at a photograph. So before we jump in and start touching this image, there's a couple of points I'd like to make to you. Before you do any sharpening of the photograph, do your noise reduction. If you run a noise reduction program either through a Lightroom, which it does a great job on raw photographs, their noise reduction is great, or denoise from Topaz, any one of those denoise programs, run that first before you start sharpening. Sharpening can really accentuate any noise that you have in the photograph, especially in smooth areas. You know, looking at these clouds up here, those are very smooth areas, and there can be noise in that. And if I over sharpen or sharpen aggressively, that noise is really going to be evident up here in the sky. And the other caveat to say is that it is impossible to restore detail that was not captured in the first place. Whether through human error or through equipment, you cannot recover and recapture. In essence, sharpening is nothing more than increasing the local contrast of details that you've already captured. Now, you may have heard this concept of pre-sharpening or input sharpening. It's a concept that believes in doing a little bit of sharpening right when you start working on the image. And the reason to do that is that it helps create some contrast between the pixels, which then all further edits tend to build on some of that contrast. So color, saturation, lights and shadows, all that type of stuff works off of a more defined image, and so the edits are better. I tend to do a little bit of input sharpening to a lot of my photographs, and the reason being is that there is sometimes some inherent softness in what we capture. No matter how great our lenses and or our camera bodies are, there are physics involved with this, folks, and sometimes those physics has a little bit of sharpness built into it. Most of our cameras have an anti-aliasing filter which helps in other parts of the image capture, and that can tend to soften the image a little bit. Likewise, you may have a lens copy that's not tack sharp at all apertures and all focal ranges, so there may be some slight softness in an image. So let's go ahead and jump into this image first off, and I'll show you a couple of techniques that I use in sharpening my image. So first off, of course, go to the Develop module, and you can see as we scroll down the Detail panel, and here I have Sharpening, Radius, Detail, and Masking. Notice that the noise reduction feature is also built into this detail panel. So if it's a raw file, which this one is, I'd go ahead and run the noise reduction. Now, doing a simple pre-sharpening or input sharpening exercise, you don't want to get too aggressive with this, because what will happen is noise will start to show up in the sky, up in these clouds. I can see just a little bit of noise, and if I crank the sharpening all the way up, I start to see more defined pixels happening up here in the sky. So I will run my denoise, get rid of most of that, and then I'll come in and I will adjust my amount to maybe 20. I'll keep my radius really small, no detail and no masking. And that's just a simple way for me to start this sort of input sharpening. All right, let's jump in and take a look at a few of these tools. Now, here's the thing to remember. When you are applying sharpening just in general, this is a global adjustment, so I will be applying sharpening to this entire image. There are ways to do localized sharpening, which I will talk about, but here, if I just increase my sharpening amount, it's affecting the entire image, from the foreground sand to the water to the rocks to the sky. And so I need to be careful about how much sharpening I apply into this image. And the big tip that I have for you is zoom into 100% when you're doing some sharpening. You can see the effects of no sharpening, to full sharpening. And when I go to full sharpening, I start to see noise and artifacts appear. So I know that I don't want to do this fully. But let's just take this down to 50, and I will stay at 100%, and I will set a sharpening value, and I'll scan around the image, and that looks good for if I only wanted to do the amount slider. But remember, I talked about the radius and the detail, and I'll give you one of the quick, powerful tips. If you hold down the Alt or Option key and then move one of the sliders, the detail or the radius slider, what you see is an outline of the image. Let me zoom back into this and you can see it better. So you can see how radius starts to affect how much sharpening is going to be applied. Now remember, radius is, when it's at 1, it will sharpen out to 1 pixel around the edge, 2 pixels and 3 pixels. And when we get big, we get a real sloppy sharpening and we start to get halos around objects. So I tend to keep this at 1 to 1.5. Detail is the fine detail that we can see that gets sharpening applied to it. And again, holding down the Alt and Option key and moving the slider back and forth, I can see how much effect it's going to have. So that's about the best I can do on those rocks the way it is. I don't have too much noise in the sky. I've got decent detail. Even though I want water motion, I want some detail here in the water, but the rocks are looking as good as they're going to get. This was not a tack sharp image because the sand was moving underneath my tripod. It was at a little bit longer shutter speed, so there's a little bit of camera movement in this photograph, but I think I have it now acceptably sharp the way I want it. Now let's take a look at the most powerful slider in the details panel, and that would be masking right here. For these three sliders to be activated, we have to have some degree of sharpening. So typically I will move my amount just off of 0, and now these three sliders are active. Now masking, this is the key slider that we want to look at. Remember on this picture I said that I don't want to sharpen the out of focus background. I just want to sharpen those elements that are in focus in this image, and that's where the masking slider comes into play. And again, if you hold the Alt or Option key down and move the slider, you see how the screen changes from 0 up to 100. Now, if you're not used to working with masks, here is the thing to remember. White reveals and black conceals. So everything that is white in this image, when I hold down the Alt and Option key, will be affected by my sharpening. Everything that is black will not be affected by the sharpening. So when I'm at masking 0, everything is going to be affected by sharpening. And as I move this, what happens is you start to see the blacks appear. Those are the areas that are not going to be sharpened. So I'm masking out the out of focus areas. And I can get this to the point where I like it, and I think right around 82, 83 for this image. And you see that the bear and the rocks are going to be affected by the sharpening. Most of the background won't be. So I have my masking set where I want. I'll let go of my mouse and the Option key. I will zoom in, and now I will start to do my fine tuning of the sharpening of the animal. And remember, so here's the radius, how big it's going to make it around the edges, and then how much, the detail, the fine detail of this. And then finally, how much sharpening do I want to have happen? So with that, this masking tool, I'm really just sharpening the bear and the rocks down here and a little bit of the water. All the background is unaffected by those sharpening adjustments I just made. All right, so the last tip I want to give you is around localized sharpening. And that's applying sharpening to a specific area of an image. In the first two images, we were using the system to detect edges and sharpening those edges wherever it found them. There may be images where I want to put a little localized sharpening to A, tighten up the image, or B, draw attention, because humans, our eyes and our brains are attracted to sharp areas, and I can use sharpness to direct an eye through an image. But for this image that we're seeing here down along the Oregon coast, I want to apply some localized sharpening just to the foreground. I don't want to sharpen the rest of the image. You know, and I could go through the masking tool that we did before and start to just apply sharpening to the grass. But notice it also, when I go back to the mask, it also applied sharpening to the mountains and the edge of the river. I just want to keep my sharpening localized to this area right here. Easiest way to do that is to come up here and select a mask and select a brush. And I'll increase the flow of my brush, make sure it's pretty high, get the size up there, and I'll take a few passes just right over this foreground grass. And I'm not too picky about what kind of sharpening, I just want it sharper. So with that foreground grass selected, when I scroll down to this highlighted panel, notice that there is a detail portion that can affect the mask. And really, I can just grab this and increase the detail as much as I want. And remember, when I increase sharpness, I may increase noise, but in this this is a busy area, I shouldn't see any visible noise in this. So using a brush to paint in sharpening or reverse sharpening, sometimes I'll do that, is I will de-emphasize an area by removing sharpness. But in this case, I want to increase sharpness in the foreground, have those grasses really pop right when the viewer comes into the scene. All right, there you go. There's a couple of quick examples of what you can do during the development process to your images to add some sharpness to your photograph, to bring out details, bring out contrast, create some visual interest in specific areas. There's a lot of great things to do. Now, what I advise all of my students is that consider this image finished at this point. Now, you may have heard this concept of output sharpening, sharpening for specific outputs. I don't know how I'm going to use my image, so I don't apply any specific output sharpening when I finish editing a photograph. I wait until I'm ready to output it for a specific use. And this is a big, big, long rabbit hole, folks, but there's sharpening for print and there's sharpening for the web. Typically when we sharpen for print, it's because we lose some detail in the photo paper or the canvas or the substrate. And so we need to add some over sharpen in essence so that the printed image looks good, looks sharp enough in the final output. And there's a lot of rules and a lot of thinking and theories around what is the right level to do this at, which is much more involved than what I'll go into in this video. But I will say, if you're printing an image that's smaller than the original file size, you typically don't need to add sharpening. If you're printing an image that's larger than the original native file size, you might want to add a little bit of sharpening to it. Now, output for the web, sharpening for the web, is a whole different course of action. And again, that's adding additional sharpness because the resolution of most people's monitors aren't superb. And we want the image to appear sharp on the screen as people see the photograph. So a lot of output for web is over sharpening an image. It doesn't look good on your monitor, but when you uploaded it to social media or a photo sharing site and people view it, it will look accurately sharp. Now there's another concept too that I preach a lot about, and that's acceptably sharp. We don't need a photograph that's tack sharp from absolutely 1 foot in front of the camera to 15 miles out. That's not the way physics work. That's not the way our eyeballs work. We expect a loss of sharpness and loss of detail as the distance increases. So I try to keep my sharpness acceptably sharp at different areas of the image depending on what the photograph is about. So this concept of being acceptably sharp. There's too much conversation around things have to be tack sharp and everybody's worried about everything being tack sharp. Let it go. If you have a wonderfully expressive photograph, if your subject is sharp, then everything else will be okay. Acceptably sharp is an acceptable concept, and I wish more people would adapt it. But now back to output. I do all of my output sharpening in Adobe Photoshop, but let me show you, Lightroom's got some handy tools for you to use if you want to use Lightroom. So the output sharpening features are in the export function of Adobe Lightroom. And you can get there either through right-clicking on the image and say export, or you can go up to File, Export. And this calls up the export dialog box. Hopefully you all have seen this before. I won't go into every little business. But what it has is this output sharpening feature here. And if you don't see it, click the little arrow, the triangle, and you can click this sharpen for screen or sharpen for matte or glossy paper. So pick the one that you want, and then you get to pick the level of sharpening that the system will apply. And it will apply sharpening across the entire image. And how you pick which one to choose here is really based upon the overall sharpness quality of the image based upon your gut feeling. Is it sort of a soft image and you want to really bump up the sharpening for the screen, go ahead and pick high. If it's an average sharpness, just a good, decent image, pick standard. Or already, if there's a lot of detail and maybe excessive sharpening might screw up the image, you might choose low. But pick one of these and then hit the export button, and the image will be sharpened as this JPEG file or whatever file you're choosing gets exported to your computer. And one final point to tell you about. Now, when we're doing sharpening, as I told you earlier, we're adjusting the contrasts, the light and the dark, between pixels. So in essence, we're adjusting tonality. As we sharpen, sometimes I have to go back to my image and adjust the lights and the darks and or adjust the color. When we're changing the tonality of the pixels themselves, it can have an impact on the overall tonality of the image as well as the colors. So I may do a round of sharpening and then go back and revisit some of the colors, the white levels, the black levels, that kind of good stuff, and make adjustments to those based upon the sharpening values that I chose. All right, folks, there you go. There's a brief primer on sharpening. I hope you incorporate sharpening into your image processing workflow and really apply a little bit of this to every photograph that you do to counteract some inherent sharpness introduced by the camera, by yourself, or just to create a little bit more visual excitement in the image. If you like this video and you're not subscribed to my channel, please feel free to hit that subscribe button, tickle the bell, hit the like, do all that kind of good stuff. Really helps support me in this channel and in order to keep creating great content for you. All right, stay tuned, have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.